Hello, and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Before we get started, please like the video if you like the video, subscribe to my channel if you want to see more, and you can always join my Patreon. We have a big goal there that I will talk about at the end of the video. One night, many years ago, in San Antonio, Texas, residents began to hear commotion in the streets and in the skies. There were sirens coming from every direction and multiple helicopters above the city, circling, following, watching. What the townspeople would later find out is that a deadly serial killer had been cornered in a local motel, but had managed to escape. What happened when he did is almost too unbelievable to be true. The woman he took next, a mother and housewife, managed to tame a psychotic maniac in a manner that the best police negotiators couldn't even believe. A maniac who is one of the most deadly serial killers America has ever known, yet almost no one knows his name. This is the story of Stephen Morin, the forgotten serial killer. Let's get into it. February 19th, 1951. Stephen Morin is born in Providence, Rhode Island, to a family that lived in poverty. Very little is known about his youth or about his childhood. I always try and bring you guys cases that you haven't heard a lot about before. It's very difficult when there's not a lot of information, but we definitely need to cover this one. Stephen dropped out of school in his preteen years, and by the time he was a teenager, he was a heavy drug user and was already involved in a criminal lifestyle. He dreamed of becoming a stock car racer, but that dream went unfulfilled. He basically up and left his family and began traveling around, committing crimes wherever he found himself in order to get the money he needed to continue. In the mid-1960s, when Stephen was about 16, he was arrested in Florida for car theft. He was convicted and spent time in a Florida home for juvenile delinquents. It's worth noting that the boys' home Stephen was put into was notorious for its terrible conditions. It was understaffed and overcrowded, and the boys were, at times, chained to the walls. They were beaten and they were abused. And in 2013, the school was excavated. Anthropologists discovered 55 graves on and around the property, filled with the bodies of boys who had basically been murdered by the staff. I'm going to try and cover that story later on, but Stephen was in this boys' home. Stephen was released in 1968 and immediately left Florida and continued wandering throughout the country. He landed in Northern California and spent most of the 1970s near San Francisco, constantly moving and using aliases while committing crimes. He worked on and off as a car mechanic, but never held down a job for a very long period. This is the time period where his crimes went from theft to murder. On September 26, 1976, Stephen committed a horrendous crime. He talked a 14-year-old girl, a friend of his sister's, into going with him to his apartment in the Marina district of San Francisco. Not long after the two got to Stephen's home, he bound the girl, hung her from a hook he had installed in the ceiling, assaulted her, and brutalized her for hours. The girl saved herself by telling Stephen, "You just need somebody to care about you. You're just hurt." Her kindness seemed to surprise and soften Stephen, and he calmed down. This is the first known incidence of real violence, and when it was over, Stephen Morin released his victim at a Marin County mall. This victim has never been named, but she did go to the authorities, and that is when they began looking for Stephen Morin. He managed to disappear for some time, and during this time, he was able to convince a woman he'd met in Buffalo to sell all of her belongings and buy a van to travel the country with him. Later on, this woman's son would report that he had helped Stephen nail carpet to the floor, walls, and ceilings of the van, a van that was used later on for abductions. Always got to have the creepy serial killer van, right? It's almost uncanny, but you know, stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason. On September 25, 1979, 22-year-old Sheila Griffin disappeared from the Silver Nugget in Las Vegas. People who knew Sheila saw her leaving with a man they did not know. She was never seen again. Sheila's friends and family looked for her for days and then weeks, but there was no trace, no clue as to what had happened to her. Then on November 27, 1979, Sheila's body was found in the Mojave Desert near the Nevada state line. She had been dumped in the dirt, and her killer had thrown a sleeping bag over her. I would love to be able to show you a photo of Sheila to remember her somehow, but this case is so poorly documented, I could not find a thing. There are sites that claim to have photos, but each site has a different photo of a different woman, and when I cannot verify that a photo is correct, I don't use it. I have to know I'm using vetted information, or I'm just not comfortable sharing it. So sadly, we don't know what Sheila looked like. Months later, another woman vanished. On January 16, 1980, 18-year-old Susan Bellotte was reported missing in Las Vegas after she failed to come home from a shopping trip. She had gone to a local shopping center to pick up a few things she needed, and she was supposed to come right back home. Again, her family and friends searched for her for weeks and then months, and sadly, this disappearance had the same outcome. Susan's body was found on May 26, 1980, about 2 miles from where I'm sitting right now. We have a suburb here in St. George called Bloomington. Susan's killer had driven her all the way to Bloomington from Las Vegas. It's about 90 miles, and he had dumped her in the bushes. I dug up an article and a photo from our town newspaper called The Spectrum of this incident. About 5 months later, 20-year-old Cheryl Daniel was abducted from the parking lot of a Las Vegas grocery store. It was called Alpha Beta. Again, a search was initiated, and again, nothing was found for months. But then Cheryl's body was found in Hellhole Canyon, which again is just miles from where I'm at now in St. George, Utah. This is Hellhole Canyon. Cheryl had been dumped there after being shot in the head. Now, the police were still looking for Stephen Morin way back from his attack on the 14-year-old girl. I couldn't find details as to how they knew these other murders were connected to him because, like I say, the details on this are so scarce, but they did. On January 11th, 1981, the Washington County Sheriff's Office issued a warrant for Stephen Morin, as these two bodies found in my area were in their jurisdiction. Stephen was wanted for the kidnapping and murders of Susan Bellotte and Cheryl Daniel. Even though the women were Las Vegas residents, there was now a warrant out for him in Utah. Stephen Morin was on the run, but that didn't stop his murderous behavior. On November 6, 1987, Stephen went on a date with a woman named Cindy Lee McDonald. For whatever reason, Stephen did not hurt Cindy. He took her home, and then he went out hunting. He picked up 23-year-old Sheila Whalen and took her to a motel room at the Mountain View Motel in Lakewood, Colorado. He was constantly moving around like a shark. In the motel room, Stephen stabbed Sheila to death and then fled the scene. Later on, Stephen's former girlfriend would find Sheila's clothing in Stephen's van, and those clothes would become a big piece of evidence in the case against him. At some point in his travels, Stephen is arrested in Pleasanton, California for false imprisonment and brandishing a weapon. He makes bail and disappears again. The 70s, man, they were just not great at keeping dangerous people locked up back then, right? Stephen then made his way from Colorado to Texas. On November 30th, 1981, 23-year-old Pamela Jackson was leaving her apartment in Corpus Christi to pick up her son. Stephen forced Pamela into his car and took her on the road with him. For 11 days, Stephen Morin kept Pamela, sexually assaulting her multiple times a day during her captivity. He also had his girlfriend with him. Nothing worse than a woman that hurts other women. Stephen made Pamela dye her hair from brown to blonde in hopes that if they were spotted together, her different hair color would throw off suspicion. The police could not find Pamela, and searches of the surrounding area did not turn up a body. Stephen Morin is now kind of in a frenzy. He knows he's wanted, he doesn't have a home, he's basically living out of motel rooms in his van, and he's committing robberies to get enough money to continue what he's doing. This is life on the edge, and as I researched the details of this story, I could almost feel the frenzy building, feel the desperation increasing as I pictured Stephen driving around from town to town, state to state, looking for his next victim, circling, like I said, like a shark. It was like he couldn't quit moving or he would die. I think the thing that makes Stephen Morin so different from a lot of killers is he had no life outside of killing. He was living simply to kill at this point. And that is a really terrifying notion. Someone whose entire existence is driven only by the thought of his next murder and only by the motivation to kill. Most serial killers have some sort of outside life. Stephen Morin did not. Killing was his entire existence. On December 2nd, 1981, a 21-year-old secretary named Jana Bruce was abducted from the Hilton Inn parking lot in Texas, where she worked. Jana was found the next day on December 3rd. They didn't have to search for her for a long period of time like they did with the other victims. Jana was found floating in 2 feet of water in a drainage ditch near Padre Island. An autopsy was performed, and the coroner found that Jana had been strangled with a ligature. She had also been tied around her face and neck. And this is something else that's very unusual about Stephen Morin. He killed in different ways. He shot some victims, he strangled others with his hands, he used ligatures on some he tied up, some he did not. And as you know, this is very unusual for a serial killer. They usually do not change or vary much from their usual methods of killing. Just 4 days later, on December 6, 1981, 29-year-old Michael Reed and 26-year-old Pearl Lutz were going to their vehicle in San Antonio. A man appeared and pointed a gun at them and tried to force them into their car. Michael fought back, and the two of them overpowered Stephen Morin, who fired at the couple. He hit both Michael and Pearl, but fortunately, they survived. They gave a description of their attacker to the police, who at this point were more than frustrated. They could not find this maniac. 5 days later, 21-year-old Carrie Scott and 25-year-old Dre Valdez were shot outside a San Antonio restaurant by Stephen when he tried to steal Carrie's car. He was desperate for a new vehicle and willing to do just about anything to get one. Carrie was shot in the back and she died at the hospital. Drew survived his injuries. The shooting occurred in front of witnesses, and now police were confident that Stephen Morin was in the area. They sent officers out to all of the areas around the shooting, and that is when they found Jana Bruce's car. Jana, remember, had been murdered, abducted and murdered 4 days earlier, and her body was found the day after she was murdered. So they surmised that the killer was now driving Jana's car. It was parked in the Sands Motel parking lot. The police surrounded the motel. They went to the desk clerk and asked him which room the man was in, showed him a picture of Stephen Morin. They were sure they had him cornered and that they were about to make the arrest of their careers. But Stephen Morin had other plans. December 11th, 1981. With a SWAT team surrounding the Sands Motel, police stormed Stephen Morin's motel room, breaking down the door and pushing into the small space. Stephen Morin was not inside. He had somehow managed to escape through the tiny bathroom window and disappear without being seen by the police surrounding the building. The room, however, was not empty. In the room was 32-year-old Sarah Clark, Stephen's girlfriend, traveling companion, and with her was Pamela Jackson, who had been abducted 11 days earlier. So thank goodness Pamela was still alive. Now the foot chase was on. The police knew the serial killer was nearby. Pamela told them that Stephen had been in the room with them until seconds before the police broke the door down. He couldn't have gone far. For hours, they searched for him, but did not find him. Stephen Morin had hidden himself away very well, but he was a desperate man and he knew he had to take action. The sun had set and it was dark and cold as Margy Palm walked to her car in the Kmart parking lot in San Antonio after doing some Christmas shopping. Suddenly, Stephen Morin, high on amphetamines and cornered by the cops, ran up to her, pointing a gun and threatening to kill her. He yelled, "What's one more damn dead bitch?" at this point. Sounds about right. Margy was not aware of the search in this area. She was not aware there was a serial killer on the loose, but she was terrified and she began to shake and tremble. This seemed to arouse Stephen Morin visibly, if you know what I'm saying. Margy got into her car with Stephen. She was too scared to move. She watched desperately as oblivious shoppers walked past her Suburban with no clue as to the abduction taking place right in front of their eyes. As Margy sat frozen in fear, her abductor, Stephen Morin, ranted about the cops closing in on him. He told her that they were both probably going to die in a shootout that day. Then Stephen noticed the gifts in the back of the Suburban, gifts that Margy had purchased for her children. Stephen started throwing them around and ranting and raving about how he had never received gifts like that as a child. He called Margy a sheltered princess and told her that animals were treated better than he was growing up. Margy tried to keep Stephen calm by telling him she was sorry that that happened to him. Later on, Margy recalled that she closed her eyes to calm herself, and then she decided that God had put her in the car with Stephen for a reason, and it was her responsibility to see him as a desperate man and not an enemy. She told a reporter, "I was not afraid of him anymore, not hating him anymore." Margy noticed that Stephen was carrying 3 knives in addition to the gun he was holding on her, but Margy began to pray. Stephen immediately said, "Oh my God, I'm in the car with a religious freak." Stephen initially believed that Margy was trying to con him with a religious act, but then she showed him she was in fact a devoted Christian. She pulled out a black notebook filled with scriptures that she had written down, and this caught Stephen off guard. Now, don't get me wrong, Stephen Morin hated women as much, if not more, as any serial killer you've ever heard about. But something about Margy softened him a little bit. I think it was because most of the time victims are terrified, and Margy was not. She was calm, and he didn't know how to handle that. He didn't know how to deal with that. It was foreign to him. He was used to women screaming and crying. Margy wasn't doing either of those things. Stephen had told Margy to sit on her hands, but Margy later recalled she decided to act kind of bizarrely in an attempt to confuse Stephen, if nothing else. She pulled her hands out from underneath her legs and raised them up towards Stephen in a stopping gesture. She then put them on Stephen's forehead and began to yell, "You evil spirits, go now. You will not keep destroying his life and destroying mine. Leave my car." Now, this is actually brilliant because you see what it does? It makes the demons responsible for the bad behavior and leaves Stephen in the clear. You guys know how I feel about this type of stuff. I don't believe in any of it, and I have a very strong distaste for people who blame demons and silly things for human behavior. It's just a way to skirt accountability. But in this instance, it was really smart. Sometimes acting like the craziest person in the room can save you. I may or may not have tried this tactic once or twice myself. Stephen Morin was definitely taken aback by Margy's behavior. Margy was surprised by her own behavior. She had never cast out demons before, but she had simply decided this was the way she was going to try and alleviate Stephen of the responsibility of his criminal act. He looked at her and said, "I don't want to hurt you, lady, but I don't know how I'm ever going to let you go." And Margy's heart sunk. Margy began to talk to Stephen Morin like she would any other person. Stephen told her of his crimes in a confessional-like manner, and as the hours passed, they got thirsty. Stephen drove them to a drive-through hamburger stand, and Stephen ordered, telling the attendant, "My girlfriend and I will take 2 Cokes." Stephen paid for the drinks, and the couple drove away. He headed towards a bus station outside of San Antonio, and he began rifling around in Margy's car. He found her cassette tape collection and told her basically it stunk. He ejected the tape that was in the deck at the time. It was a sermon by televangelist Kenneth Copeland, and he asked Margy, "What is this shit?" Noting that all of her tapes were praise music. He told Margy, "You're really a fanatic." Then he stopped at a 7-Eleven and bought beer, and they continued on. Stephen continued to rummage through Margy's tapes, and finally, he found something he liked. He said to Margy, "If you have what I think you have, you're one f***ing cool lady." He then popped in the Christopher Cross tape he found and said, "You've got my favorite." He rewound the tape to the beginning of the song, "Ride Like the Wind," and cranked the volume as high as it would go and began to sing along. "It is the night, my body's weak, I'm on the run, no time to sleep. I've got to ride like the wind to be free again. Margy noticed how quickly Stephen became calm, and she felt his deep connection to this song. Now, when Stephen had stopped at 7-Eleven to get beer and cigarettes, he had taken Margy into the store with him. And there, on a newspaper rack, she saw a front page headline. It said, "Accused killer of 30, guns down 2 in San Antonio." When Margy saw that headline, she just about lost it. This man has killed over 30 people. Now, I know we haven't documented 30 murders here today. For one, they're not well documented. I could only find information on the better known murders. And two, we do have some time restrictions here. But at any rate, Margy was completely freaking out on the inside, but on the outside, she tried to remain cool and calm. She thought about whether or not she should tell the cashier at the 7-Eleven she had been abducted, but she noticed that the young girl working behind the register was alone, and she didn't want to risk her life, so she said nothing. When they left the 7-Eleven, Stephen forced Margy into a phone booth and at gunpoint told her to call her husband and tell him that everything was fine. So Margy did that. She told her husband Bart to bathe the kids and feed them as she was going to stay out late shopping. Now, Margy had never asked Bart to help with the kids. The 70s, where men did not help with anything. But Bart just figured she was really busy with shopping, even though he thought it was odd she was asking him to do chores. So he got the kids off to bed, but then it was 10 p.m. and Margy still wasn't home. Stephen sat down and turned on the news and saw that there was a killer on the loose, and that's when he called the police. I was kind of surprised to hear that he immediately felt something was wrong. I mean, his wife could have been 1,000 different places, but he really felt like it was so out of character for her to not come home and to ask him to help with the kids that something was wrong. By this time, Margy and Stephen had been in the car for hours, and all along, Margy had been preaching to Stephen about forgiveness. Suddenly, Stephen pulled the car over and put his hands in the air and said, "I'm sorry, Lord, for everything I've done. Please forgive me. I want to go to heaven." Then he took the bullets out of his gun and dumped them into Margy's purse. But let's not be gullible, my friends. He had plenty of backup bullets in his pocket. This is a maniac, after all. The act of dumping the bullets was mostly for show. At one point in the evening, Stephen even pulled an earring out of his pocket and gave it to Margy. She later found out that part of Stephen's MO was giving the women he murdered these same earrings. They were a cross with a green stone in the middle. Very interesting that he had some things that were very methodical, giving each woman the same earring, but then other things were not methodical at all. He used different manners of killing, and he picked victims from different places. Just an interesting guy, an interesting case, and I wish we knew more. Margy and Stephen had now driven 65 miles north of San Antonio and were at a bus station in Kerrville. Stephen used Margy's ATM card to withdraw $300 and told her that he was going to get on the next bus to Fort Worth. Stephen actually said to Margy, "You don't want to come with me?" She said, "I have 2 kids at home. You've got to get on that bus. God is with you." Stephen then hugged Margy and asked if he could kiss her on the cheek, which he did. She gave him her notebook of scriptures, and then he was gone. Margy then drove home. She did not go to the police. When she pulled into the driveway, her angry husband was standing there and yelled, "Where the hell have you been? I've been thinking you've been with this rapist." Margy said, "I have been with him." The color drained from Bart's face, and that's when Margy realized the police were already at her house. Bart had already called them. Margy gets her purse and opens it up and shows the police the bullets that the serial killer had dropped inside. And then she looked up at one of the cops and said, "I need a drink." One of the officers yelled, "Somebody get her a stiff drink." Bart went inside the house and made Margy a martini, and the police loaded Bart and Margy into the back of a patrol car with Margy holding her martini in the car, and they headed to the police station. Over the next few hours, Margy would come to learn that she was very, very, very lucky indeed. She had just spent the evening with a psychopathic maniac and had lived to tell the tale. But Margy made a very strange decision in the police station. She didn't tell the police that she knew where Stephen was headed. She later said she was afraid he would return and kill her family. But I can't help but wonder if Margy wasn't a little infatuated with Stephen. He is kind of a nice-looking guy in a character actor sort of way. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe she had a little Stockholm syndrome. She was feeling sympathetic towards him. But when Margy and Bart got home from the police station, she told her husband she knew where Stephen was headed. And Bart immediately called the cops and told Margy that it would be on her if Stephen killed somebody else. And that's when she told them she knew where he was going. Margy told the police that the bus Stephen was on left for Fort Worth at 3:30 a.m. and it was now 2:45. They had 45 minutes to grab him. Bart was surprised to hear the cops say, "We've been looking for this guy for years. He's not stupid. He's not going to be at that bus stop." But they went there anyway, and to their surprise, the serial killer was sitting calmly in a chair, waiting for his bus. A police officer slowly approached Stephen Morin. She identified herself, and he calmly stood up and allowed himself to be handcuffed. He didn't resist at all. The press went wild over the story of a Texas housewife talking down a serial killer from his drug-fueled murder spree. People couldn't get enough of the story. The religious people were praising God and saying it was Margy's faith that saved her. The psychologists were praising Margy's intellect and saying it was the way she separated Stephen from his behavior and talked kindly to him that saved her. Either way, people were obsessed with the story. Stephen Morin was put on trial in April of 1982. This prolific serial killer, who has now been all but forgotten, stood in a courtroom in Beaumont, Texas, and shockingly asked if he could speak. The papers reported it like this. In a scene that would make Perry Mason fans' heart leap, Morin said, "Before the jury and before God, I plead guilty." They said there were gasps in the galley. The judge asked the killer if he understood that this plea would result in life in prison or a death sentence with no chance of negotiation. And Stephen replied, "The only plea bargaining I've done, Your Honor, is with my Lord." Stephen Morin was then sentenced to death. He stood trial several more times, each time pleading guilty and stating he wasn't afraid to die because he was now a Christian. How nice for him, I wish his terrified and beaten and tortured victims had the chance to become unafraid of dying, but they didn't, In prison, Stephen Morin and Margy Palm continued their friendship and wrote letters. Stephen claimed he was a changed man. And then, during a search of his cell, officers found $50, a bunch of razor blades, and a list of names and addresses, along with a Texas driver's license. This guy hadn't changed at all. He was planning an escape, and he was planning revenge. Margy continued to write to Stephen and tell him that through God, he could be saved. Now, there is a lot more to this story, the story of Margy and Stephen's relationship. But in the end, as it usually does, the law got its way and justice was served. On March 13th, 1985, Stephen Morin was taken to the Death Watch cell at the Huntsman unit in Texas. He requested a last meal, which I am going to show you and eat later on an episode of Dining with the Damned, and he was then given a last visit with his family and his girlfriend. Stephen was taken to the death chamber and he was executed. He was dead at only 34 years of age. Margy Palmer went on to give lectures about her ordeal, and she continued working with televangelists and religious organizations. She even visited Stephen Morin on death row several times before he was executed. Regardless of what we think of her actions, there is no question she was brave and she was extraordinary on the night of her abduction. This is what Margy looks like now. She's 72 years old and living happily, continuing the work that she's involved in. Stephen Morin's name has been mostly lost to the ages, which begs the question, why? Perhaps that's something we need to dive into one day. Ted Bundy was operating at the same time as Stephen. They're both maybe better than average looking guys who did terrible things, yet one became a household name and the other is almost totally forgotten. Why do you think that is? I don't know what I think. Let me know in the comments. And let's all take a moment to be grateful that the last woman Stephen Morin ever abducted was also the one who stopped him. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Hit the like button if you like the video, subscribe to my channel if you want to see more from me, and you can always join my Patreon. For a few dollars a month, if that's what you can give, you help keep the channel alive. It's all that's keeping the channel alive at this point. But in the end, we want to raise money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that cannot be tested because there's no money to test it. There are thousands of sexual assault kits in refrigeration that have never been tested. They cost between $500 and $700 each to test. We want to get those kits tested for two reasons. The first is, obviously, it might help solve the case the DNA is associated with. Secondly, it gets that perpetrator's DNA in the system in case that perpetrator has committed other crimes. It's a big goal, it's a lofty goal, it's taking a while to get there, but I'm not giving up. Thank you, my friends, for spending a little bit of your day with me. Your support means more than I will ever be able to let you know. Stay safe and be kind to each other, and I will see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.